The fog moves slowly along the river this morning, dragging itself over the water as if reluctant to rise. It settles between the bare trees lining the service road behind the Marshfield County Sheriff's Office, softening everything it touches. Inside the building, past the locked downstairs corridor, a single fluorescent light blooms in the evidence reprocessing room. It is early enough that the hallways are still quiet, the kind of quiet that belongs to places where secrets have waited too long. Sergeant Mara Ellison stands over a stainless steel table, her hands resting on the battered cardboard box she retrieved from cold storage an hour earlier. She has seen hundreds of boxes like this, one sagging corners, faded marker, paper tags that look older than they should, but somehow this one feels heavier, not by weight, but by history. By the things it contains that no one has dared to look at in years. She takes a slow breath and lifts the lid. Brown packing paper, brittle from time, crackles under her touch. Nested inside is a sealed evidence bag, its plastic clouded and stiff. Through the haze, the shape emerges. A single latex glove, lightly crumpled, the fingertips curled inward as if frozen mid-motion. The chain of custody tag is yellowed, the ink thinning, but still clear enough to read. It lists a date from the mid-90s, a complex near the river, and initials belonging to a crime scene technician who retired long before Mara joined the force. Tessa Rourke steps into the room, tying her hair back as she snaps on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves. She's young, bright, and still believes in the idea that every unanswered question deserves at least one more attempt. When she sees the glove through the plastic, her shoulders stiffen. "This is the one you mentioned?" she asks, her voice low. Mara nods. "Stored properly. Never opened since the last run. If anything survived, it's in there." Tessa lifts the bag, turning it slowly so the overhead light sweeps across the surface. The glove makes a soft whisper inside, a delicate sound that seems too small for the damage it once represented. She holds it like something fragile, something that carries the faint imprint of a moment no one could escape from. "This could change everything," she says, barely above a whisper. Mara doesn't reply. She watches the glove instead, imagining the man who wore it. Imagining his steps across a riverside apartment floor all those years ago. Imagining the quiet certainty with which he moved through other people's spaces, leaving only fear behind. The fog outside thickens, dimming the narrow window in the hallway. The whole building feels suspended, as if the air itself knows something is shifting. Tessa sets the evidence bag on the tray used for items being prepared for transfer to the state lab. She notes the case number and signs the transport form, her pen scratching softly. "DNA extractions come a long way," she says. "Even degraded residues can give us a clean profile now. If he left anything at all, we'll find it." Mara feels the words more than she hears them. She remembers the calls from victims she inherited as a young detective. She remembers their steady patience, their practiced calm, and the weight of uncertainty they lived with for years. She has carried that weight with them, storing it somewhere just out of sight. Now in this room, with this single glove between them, she feels the balance beginning to tilt. Tessa seals the transport container, sliding it into its padded carrier. The latch clicks shut, a small final sound that feels like a promise. Mara checks her watch. The courier to Columbus will arrive in 20 minutes. 12 hours after that, the glove will be on a stainless steel counter in a genomics lab, surrounded by tools and methods that didn't exist when the evidence was first collected. What was invisible then may not be invisible anymore. A muffled sound echoes down the hallway, the building waking up, other deputies arriving, phones starting to ring. But the evidence room remains still. Tessa places both hands briefly on the carrier, grounding herself, then looks at Mara. "Do you ever think he believed something like this would catch up to him?" she asks. Mara shakes her head. "People like him depend on time to bury everything. They never expect someone to start digging again." The fog outside presses against the windows, turning the glass a muted gray. Somewhere beyond the river, traffic hums through the morning. unaware that the ground beneath an entire town is about to shift. Tessa lifts the carrier and steps toward the door. Mara stays behind for a moment longer, staring at the empty table, the faint outline where the glove bag had rested. The air feels different now, lighter, sharper, full of motion after decades of stillness. As the door closes and the fluorescent light hums over the empty room, the story's center of gravity moves, with it out of storage into sunlight, into the hands of people who know how to listen to evidence that never stopped speaking. To understand how this began, we go back to 1994. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe now. It helps us bring more truth to light. Before the case file ever carried her name, before investigators began marking dots on maps and rearranging timelines, Lauren Pike lived a life that looked almost painfully ordinary. Riverton Heights wasn't a place built for spectacle. Days unfolded the same way for most people. Early light over the river, factory whistles in the distance, the shifting glow of hospital windows, the steady rhythms of a town that relied on routine to feel safe. Lauren fit into that rhythm seamlessly, the way someone who has learned to survive long hours and short nights tends to do. She worked at Riverton Heights University Hospital, mostly the late swing and overnight shifts in the emergency department. It was the kind of work that left you tired down to the bone. But Lauren had chosen nursing for reasons that had nothing to do with schedules. She liked being needed in ways that were simple and immediate. She liked the feeling of stepping into a crisis and steadying it, even if just for a moment. She liked seeing people breathe easier because someone understood what to do. Her co-workers knew her as the calm center in the storm. She wasn't loud or overly cheerful, but she had a reassuring way of being present. When new nurses felt overwhelmed, they drifted toward her naturally. When patients were scared, her quiet instructions loosened their grip on the bed rails. She had a way of softening the sharpest edges in people. Her apartment sat among a row of modest riverfront buildings where students, single parents, and shift workers lived side by side. The unit was small, with 2 bedrooms, a balcony facing the water, and thin carpet that never quite matched the walls. Her roommate, a graduate student named Nina, often worked on her laptop at the kitchen table, surrounded by textbooks and half-finished cups of tea. The 2 women formed an easy friendship that didn't require much talking. Their routines overlapped just enough to make the place feel less lonely. Lauren's mornings usually began with the harsh flicker of fluorescent lights in the hospital locker room. She kept a small photo taped inside her locker, her younger brother giving a crooked smile at a summer cookout years earlier. No inspirational quotes or decorative charms, just that single picture. She never replaced it, even when the tape began to curl. Her co-workers teased her gently, saying she should add more life to her locker, but Lauren preferred the quiet consistency of one familiar face to greet her at the end of a shift. On her walk to the parking lot after work, she often paused on the small pedestrian bridge that crossed the drainage canal behind the hospital. It was a habit she never explained to anyone. Maybe it was the cool air rising off the water after hours of stale indoor heat. Or maybe she needed those few minutes to transition from emergency room chaos to something resembling normal life. She would stand there, leaning slightly on the railing, watching pale morning light ripple across the canal's surface before getting into her car. Her car was an aging sedan with a stubborn heater and a radio that flickered in and out whenever she drove past the metal warehouse district. She didn't mind. She liked the silence between static. She liked the thin coil of steam rising from her travel mug as she took slow sips on the drive home. She liked the way the river looked in the early morning, the fog clinging low to the ground like a reluctant curtain, muffling everything in soft gray. Inside her apartment, her symbolic habits emerged in small, nearly invisible ways. She always placed her keys in the same ceramic bowl near the door, a bowl she'd made in an introductory pottery class years earlier. The bowl was misshapen and a little too heavy on one side, but she kept it because she liked that it wasn't perfect. On the balcony, she kept a single potted plant that she watered inconsistently but never let die. It wasn't lush or thriving, but it endured in its own stubborn way, just like she did. She wrote short reminders to herself on sticky notes, not to manage tasks but to manage feelings. The notes rarely said anything dramatic. Breathe. Call mom on Sunday. Sleep before coffee. They were simple, almost childlike messages, but they kept her grounded during weeks when the air felt like a storm that refused to let up. On weekends, when she wasn't working, she cooked big meals that she often ended up sharing with neighbors. She made soups in winter, pasta dishes in spring, and a rotation of comfort foods she never got tired of. People who barely knew her always noted that she seemed to carry a quiet warmth and unspoken kindness that made even casual acquaintances feel at ease. But she also carried something else, a sense of wariness she never talked about. It wasn't fear exactly, but a subtle alertness, like someone who had learned long ago that safety shouldn't be taken for granted. She checked her doors twice before bed. She kept the balcony latch closed even in summer. She slept with a small light on in the hallway. She never said these things made her feel safe. She just said they made the night quieter. On the day before everything changed, Lauren's shift ended at 6 in the morning. It had been a hard night, a highway pileup, an elderly patient in cardiac distress, a series of minor crises that piled up one after another. She left the hospital exhausted, sliding her stethoscope into her bag and rubbing the tension from her neck. Outside, the air tasted of cool river moisture. Fog drifted across the service road, dampening the sharpness of sunrise. She drove home the same route she always took, the river on her right, old warehouses on her left, the streetlights still glowing faintly as they surrendered to daylight. At the apartment, Nina was asleep, a light still on in her room, the glow spilling across the hallway carpet. Lauren moved quietly, placed her keys in the ceramic bowl, and set her bag near the table with practiced efficiency. After washing her face and changing into soft cotton clothes, she stepped out onto the balcony for a moment. The river reflected a dull silver sheen, the surface almost motionless. She held her mug between her palms, feeling the warmth seep slowly into her fingers. A faint breeze carried the scent of wet earth and distant diesel fumes from the industrial road. She thought about calling her mother but decided against it. She would call that evening instead. She thought about taking a nap but ended up sitting at the small desk in her room, writing a new sticky note. Be gentle with yourself today. She placed it over an older one that had lost its stickiness. Later in the afternoon, she spoke briefly with her brother on the phone. They talked about nothing urgent: his new job, her long week, a birthday gift she hadn't mailed yet. She laughed once, a low, warm sound that made him laugh too. As night settled in, the apartment grew quiet again. Nina went out to meet friends. Lauren reheated leftovers, showered, and prepared for another shift the next day. She double-checked the back door, then walked to the balcony to close the curtains fully. A thin ripple of wind brushed the hem of the fabric, carrying with it the faint smell of the river. When she finally lay down, she felt the fatigue settle into her limbs in a way that promised deep sleep. She reached for her bedside lamp and switched it off, leaving only the soft glow from the hallway to filter into her room. This was her last quiet night. Her last ordinary call with her brother. Her last handwritten reminder on a yellow sticky note. Everything after this moment would be marked differently. Everything that followed would be cataloged, measured, and stored in a box that would not be opened again for decades. And none of it had happened yet. The night that would reshape the lives of everyone who knew her began without conflict or warning. Riverton Heights settled under a blanket of humid August air, the river holding the heat from the day like a slow pulse. From her apartment balcony, Lauren could see faint ripples on the water, barely visible under the glow from the distant street lamps. Around 9 that evening, she finished her meal, washed the bowl she'd eaten from, and smoothed the corners of a fresh sticky note on her desk. She didn't write anything that night. She planned to, but exhaustion tugged at her, and she decided to save the thought for the morning. Shortly after 10, she messaged her brother that she'd call him tomorrow, then placed her phone on the nightstand. Nina was out with friends and wouldn't be home until later. The apartment was still, the kind of stillness that settles over a place shared by people who trust one another. The hallway light glowed softly, and Lauren left it on, as she always did, a habit less about fear and more about gentle continuity. Around 10:45, she checked the back balcony latch again. It was secure. She jiggled it lightly to make sure, then walked back to her room, closing the curtains fully. The apartment's air conditioner clicked on and off, struggling against the heavy night. In her room, the faint scent of her lavender laundry detergent lingered on the sheets. She crawled into bed and closed her eyes. The timeline becomes clearer in hindsight: phone records, neighbors' statements, and the physical condition of the apartment the next morning, each marking moments with chilling precision. Lauren likely fell asleep within minutes. The complex itself was quiet. Students still away for summer break, warehouse shifts already completed, most residents tucked into their routines. Only the river moved, steady and indifferent. At some point between 11:10 and 11:30, a figure moved along the narrow path behind the apartment building. It was a walkway used mostly by dog owners and early morning joggers, not somewhere anyone expected trouble at that hour. The trees along the riverbank created pockets of shadow that blended into the edges of the building. Motion sensor lights did not reach this side of the complex. They had been positioned to deter people from tampering with vehicles in the parking lot, not to protect balconies. The intruder observed the units with the ease of someone who already understood the layout. He took a measured path along the building's backside, pausing under Lauren's balcony. Investigators later concluded he had likely identified her unit long before this night. He would have known when lights turned on, when the roommate left, when the shift nurse returned home, and how long she stayed awake. The latch on the balcony door, though secured by Lauren, was one of the older models, the kind that could be disturbed if enough force was applied in the right direction. At approximately 11:35, the intruder climbed onto the balcony. The railing bore faint impressions later detected with forensic powder, but at the time they were invisible, quiet marks left in the dark. The sliding door nudged inward, just enough to give him access to the narrow space that led into the living room. The sound was small, nearly indistinguishable from the sigh of wind that moved through the trees that night. Inside, the apartment carried the soft warmth of a lived-in space. A faint light from the hallway illuminated part of the living room, casting long, slow shadows across the carpet. The ceramic key bowl rested near the door, Lauren's keys still inside. A single mug sat drying on the counter. Nothing suggested danger. Nothing suggested an intrusion. The intruder moved silently. Investigators later determined that he must have paused near the entry of Lauren's bedroom, observing her as she slept. The details of what followed were reconstructed entirely from the aftermath, what Lauren was able to recall, and what the scene revealed. Her memory of the night came in fragments, fractured by fear, but certain pieces remained sharp. The scent of latex, the sound of a floorboard shifting, the outline of a masked figure standing where no one should have been. Just after midnight, a neighbor in the adjacent unit reported hearing something unusual. Not a scream or a struggle, just the sound of someone stumbling against furniture, followed by a muffled thud. At the time, she dismissed it as one of the many restless movements of tenants living close together. Only later did she understand what she had heard. The crime scene timeline narrowed between midnight and 12:40. When the intruder left, he did so through the balcony again, stepping over the rail and descending into the shadows below. The apartment's front door remained locked, keys still in the ceramic bowl. There were no signs of forced entry, no splintered locks, no broken windows. There was only the faint disturbance of the sliding door and the lingering smell of latex and detergent. At 12:43, Lauren, in shock, dialed for help. Her voice on the recording was barely above a whisper, pushed through confusion and adrenaline. The dispatcher remained calm, guiding her through basic questions, but Lauren struggled to answer. She repeated that someone had been in her room. She repeated that she had woken up and the shape was there. She repeated that she was scared to walk through the apartment alone. Officers arrived within minutes. The building was quiet, no one out of place. They knocked softly and identified themselves. When Lauren opened the door, she appeared pale, shaking, and holding her elbow as though she had bumped it during the ordeal. They asked whether she needed medical attention. She said no. She only wanted the police to check the apartment and make sure he was gone. The officers swept the rooms calmly and methodically. In the living room, they observed nothing unusual. In the kitchen, they noticed the mug and a dish towel neatly folded beside it. In the hallway, the soft glow of the night light seemed untouched. Only in the bedroom did they find the first clue, the faint indentation on the carpet near the foot of the bed, as though a knee had pressed into the fibers. A crime scene technician arrived shortly afterward. He was meticulous, moving through the small apartment with practiced care. He dusted the sliding door, the balcony rail, and the doorframe leading into Lauren's room. He bagged the bedsheet as evidence. He collected a swab from the doorknob. But it was on the balcony, under the faint light spilling from the living room, that he found the object that would later define the case. The latex glove lay near the sliding doors track, palm turned upward, fingertips slightly curled. It appeared almost placed, though investigators could never confirm whether it was dropped accidentally or left behind intentionally. The technician lifted it carefully with gloved hands, sliding it into an evidence bag and sealing the top with a dated label. The chain of custody slip would bear his initials, preserved for decades. Lauren watched from the living room couch, wrapped in a blanket, her breathing unsteady. She tried to answer questions, but her thoughts scattered like loose pages. She remembered the glove. She remembered the shape of a masked face. She remembered the feeling of being watched even after she woke up. And she remembered the strange moment when the intruder seemed to hesitate, standing over her as though waiting for something only he understood. When the officers finished, they assured her they would stay outside until her roommate returned. Lauren thanked them mechanically, nodding as though each word cost her something. She walked from room to room, turning on lights she had never turned on at night before. The apartment felt unfamiliar. The shadows felt longer, sharper. She double-checked the balcony door, even though the officers had already secured it. In the following days, the case unfolded with predictable urgency. Interviews, statements, follow-up visits. A decision to rotate patrol cars through the complex more often. A list of registered offenders in the area, none of whom matched the behavior described. A stack of incomplete leads that drifted into silence as weeks passed. The latex glove went to the state lab, but technology at the time could not extract a complete DNA profile. The report was logged as inconclusive. The odd detail remained the balcony door. The latch had no visible damage, and the frame showed no splintering. Yet something about the fit was off, just a millimeter of looseness that seemed too minor to explain how someone had entered. Maintenance workers examined it twice, confirming the door was functional. But later investigators would note that an older model of sliding latch could be manipulated if someone knew how to apply pressure at the right angle. The clue was never resolved. It became one more unanswered question in a case defined by unanswered questions. At the time, all Lauren knew was that her home no longer felt like hers. Something had shifted, something essential, something that couldn't be repaired with a locksmith's tools or a police patrol. It was a change that would follow her for years, carried silently into every room she entered, every routine she repeated, every night she tried to sleep. And on the river outside, the current kept moving, carrying the heat of late summer into the early hours of the morning, unaware that a story had just begun that would take decades to understand. The first weeks after the assault moved with a kind of urgency that gave everyone the illusion of progress. Officers canvassed the apartment complex, interviewed neighbors, and pulled lists of anyone with a record of trespassing or assault within 20 miles of Riverton Heights. The detective assigned to the case at the time Daniel Kessler, spent his evenings hunched over his desk, sorting through reports with a determination that bordered on obsession. He believed that whatever had happened to Lauren Pike couldn't have been the intruder's first act. People did not suddenly cross a threshold like that. There were almost always earlier shadows, earlier signs. But early confidence slowly turned into quiet frustration. The first suspect was a warehouse worker who lived 2 buildings away, a man with a temper and a reputation for showing up at people's doors uninvited when he'd been drinking. His interview carried tension. He denied everything but stumbled over his timeline. Officers searched his apartment, took his fingerprints, and compared his shoe size to a faint underside print on the balcony rail. Nothing matched. He wasn't their man. Then there was a local transient believed to have been sleeping near the river that night. Several residents reported seeing someone who resembled him wandering around the complex earlier that week. When officers found him, he said he'd been chasing a stray dog that kept stealing from his campsite. His story sounded unlikely until they followed him to the river's edge and found scraps of food torn open on the grass. He had no connection to the apartment complex beyond circumstance and hunger. His name, too, was cleared. By October, the department began receiving calls from people who recognized small details from the news. A man phoned in to say he thought his ex-roommate fit the description of someone capable of such an act. Another woman urged police to investigate her neighbor, who often peered through blinds at odd hours. A college student insisted a teaching assistant made her uncomfortable and should be looked into. Each lead was pursued carefully, and each one collapsed under scrutiny. Kessler once remarked to a colleague that the flood of false suspicion made it feel like the whole town was pointing at shadows. Lauren, meanwhile, did her best to return to her routines. But the police check-ins, the reminders of unanswered questions, and the lingering fear in her own home built a kind of internal exhaustion that no one else could see. She spoke to Kessler several times in the months following the assault, always patient, always trying to remember details. Once, she apologized for not being able to describe the intruder's voice more clearly. Kessler had closed his notebook gently and said, "You don't apologize for surviving." She appreciated the sentiment, but it didn't erase the weight of not knowing. As the months passed, the case became more complicated. Similar assaults occurred in 2 neighboring towns, Hollow Bend and East Riverton. Both involved a masked man entering apartments late at night, both near river access points or wooded trails, both with victims who lived alone or with one roommate. None of the victims had seen the intruder clearly, and in all 3 cases, he left nothing behind except fear. For a moment, it seemed the cases might connect. Kessler met with detectives from both towns, spreading maps across tables and comparing notes. The details aligned too neatly to ignore. But when they requested DNA results from the earlier cases, neither had workable samples. In Lauren's case, the latex glove swab produced only a partial profile, too incomplete to be compared effectively with the small databases of that era. In another case, a contaminated swab rendered the evidence useless. The third case had no recoverable DNA at all. A detective from Hollow Bend voiced the frustration everyone felt. "He's too careful. He gives us nothing. And the little he does give, our tech can't use." Another detective replied, "We're fighting someone who learned how to disappear inside a place that's too used to minding its own business." Public attention faded quickly. Local newspapers shifted focus to warehouse layoffs and city elections. Most neighbors assumed the case was either solved quietly or forgotten. The reality was neither. The file remained active, but movement slowed to a crawl. Whenever Kessler suggested sending evidence to a larger lab out of county, budget constraints shut the idea down. DNA analysis was still expensive, and cold cases weren't a priority. By the second year, Lauren's case had joined a quiet cluster of similar incidents, each marked by the same signature: a careful intruder who moved through rooms like someone navigating hallways they already knew. Detectives interviewed more than a dozen possible suspects, including maintenance workers, groundskeepers, former tenants, and night shift employees at various surrounding businesses. A janitor at the hospital caught their attention briefly. He had a history of petty theft and was known for lingering in places he shouldn't, but his alibi was solid that night. He had clocked out at 10 and taken the bus home, confirmed by both time logs and security cameras. Investigators turned next to a former boyfriend of one of the neighboring victims. He was questioned twice. The man grew angry during the second interview and accused police of harassment. His fingerprints and DNA were voluntarily provided, but didn't match anything available. Then there was a drifter caught breaking into cars near the complex a few months later. Officers held him for questioning, searching for any connection, but he had no ties to any of the victims, and admitted he avoided occupied homes because people shoot first around here. Over time, the list of false suspects grew so long that Kessler began keeping a separate folder labeled Noise. It held dozens of pages filled with names, addresses, and notes like "no match," "not in town," and "alibi confirmed." The pile grew thicker each year, a testament to how thoroughly the case resisted every attempt to be solved. Lauren tried to keep living her life. She switched bedrooms with Nina, preferring the room farther from the balcony. She changed the lock on the sliding door, even though the officers had already installed a new latch. She bought a different bedside lamp, something brighter, because she couldn't stand how shadows stretched across her room at night. She continued her work at the hospital, but colleagues noticed she startled more easily, especially when male patients raised their voices. She wasn't withdrawn exactly, but she carried an alertness that made her seem older, as though something essential had shifted inside her. 3 years after the assault, Lauren moved to another apartment across town. She didn't tell many people why. She simply said the river felt too close, and the nights felt too long. Her move didn't close the emotional distance she now lived with, but it helped her reclaim a sense of space. Still, when officers checked in periodically, she answered every question with the same steady patience she had shown from the beginning. For investigators, the case slipped into a procedural lull. Kessler retired in the early 2000s, leaving behind a note in the file that read, "This one needs another shot when technology catches up." His replacement reopened the case briefly in 2004, but without new leads or stronger DNA, he had nowhere to go. A young detective assigned in 2007 tried again, cross-referencing the cases with a neighboring county's assault patterns, but once more found no usable evidence. By then, the cultural landscape had shifted. Surveillance cameras began appearing in retail centers and parking lots, but older apartment buildings remained untouched. The intruder had moved between places where anonymity was easy and records were sparse. His footprint remained faint, almost intentional in its minimalism. The department faced pressure to prioritize newer cases. Files like Lauren's were placed deeper in storage, still active but rarely revisited. At one point, a lieutenant suggested formally closing some of the older unsolved cases without leads. The idea sparked pushback from a handful of detectives, but the practical reality was clear. Without DNA, without new witnesses, without repeated offenses in recent years, there was nowhere left to look. Lauren understood this unspoken truth. She stopped expecting calls about updates. She stopped asking whether anything new had been found. She lived her life with the shadows tucked into the corners, aware they hadn't vanished but content to place them where she could at least predict them. The file remained on the shelf, marked by the date of the last documented attempt, edges worn from years of handling. The latex glove sat sealed in an evidence box, its label faded, its value uncertain. It had become a symbol of the limits of the era, a reminder that sometimes justice didn't move forward, not because no one cared, but because the tools weren't ready. And so, after more than a decade of stalled efforts, false suspects, failed leads, and exhausted investigators, the file finally settled into quiet. It wasn't closed officially. It simply stopped moving. In the dim light of the evidence room in 2009, a clerk slid the box deeper onto the shelf. unaware that the case had reached the end of its first life. It would stay there, untouched and waiting, for almost another decade. Time did not heal the wound so much as it smoothed its edges into something people learned to live beside. For Lauren Pike, the years following her assault unfolded in quiet, determined increments. She returned to work at the hospital, first part-time, then full shifts again. She became the nurse new hires gravitated toward: steady, patient, someone who had clearly seen both the worst and the best of people. But something in her eyes changed. The softness remained, but the openness lessened. She kept her voice warm, but her presence stayed measured, as though she were always listening for something beyond the spoken world. Her family adapted in their own ways. Her mother, who lived an hour south in a smaller town, called more frequently after the assault. At first, every day, then every week. Then whenever she sensed a low note in Lauren's voice. Her mother never asked for details, she knew better, but she repeated certain lines so consistently that they became a kind of protective chant. "You're stronger than this, you're not alone, we'll get through it." When Lauren tried to redirect the conversation to work or her brother's job, her mother let her, understanding that normal talk was its own kind of balm. Her brother, meanwhile, carried the weight differently. He felt guilt for being young, for not noticing the tension growing in Lauren even before the night of the attack. Guilt for not having been there that night, even though there was no reason he could have been. Over the years, he moved through various jobs, cities, and relationships, but whenever someone new asked about his sister, he hesitated. He wanted to tell the truth, but he also wanted to protect her story, to keep it from being swallowed by curiosity or pity. So he described her as a nurse in Riverton Heights, someone who cared deeply for people, someone he admired. He never mentioned the night that lived between them like a quiet, unspoken pact. As the early 2000s arrived, the world around Riverton Heights began to shift. The riverfront warehouses closed one by one, their windows boarded or left to gather dust. The university hospital expanded, adding new wings with sharper lines and brighter lights. Younger residents moved in, reshaping small pockets of the town into lively corners filled with coffee shops and late-night eateries. Yet some parts remained unchanged. The older apartment complexes, the narrow roads near the river, the places where memory clung like humidity. Lauren moved through these changes with the deliberate grace of someone who refused to let trauma define her completely. She took on leadership roles at the hospital, mentored new nurses, and eventually helped redesign the emergency department's patient intake system. She built a life that had meaning, even if it carried shadows. There were years when she rarely thought about the intruder. Then there were nights when a sound in the hallway or the pattern of shadows across her ceiling brought everything back in a rush. On those nights, she often brewed tea long after midnight, sitting at her small kitchen table and scribbling thoughts onto her sticky notes. Some of them made sense. Some didn't. Some simply said, "Still here," as if she were reminding herself that survival counted for something. Her old photos faded with time. The picture of her and Nina, taken on the balcony during their first spring in the apartment, curled at the edges. The river behind them looked almost peaceful in the faint sepia tint that aging film sometimes created. But Lauren rarely looked at that picture, because she could still remember the night she called the police, her hands shaking so hard she could barely hold the phone. That memory sat behind the photograph like a second exposure. Nina eventually moved out, finding work in another city. She kept in touch with Lauren through annual holiday messages, occasional visits, and a few emotional conversations where she admitted she still felt guilty for not being home the night of the assault. Lauren always dismissed the guilt gently. It wouldn't have changed anything, she said. But Nina never fully believed her. Over the years, a few journalists contacted Lauren about writing articles on unsolved cases or incomplete investigations. She always declined. She understood their intentions, but she didn't want her story reshaped or trimmed or turned into a headline. She preferred to live quietly, to let the details rest where she had placed them. Detectives who had worked on her case retired, transferred, or left the field entirely. Their notes became layers of the same unanswered questions. The latex glove, the sliding door, the timeline reconstructed from fragments. In the late 2000s, Marshfield investigators conducted a brief case review, prompted by an uptick in professional training on cold case methodology. They revisited old evidence, preserving what they could, but each attempt led to the same conclusion. The DNA sample extracted from the glove was too limited, too degraded, too partial for meaningful comparison. When Lauren learned the results, she nodded with a kind of acceptance, not disappointment. She had learned long ago to brace for inconclusive answers. As the years pressed on, the town changed even more. Children born in the late 90s grew up, went to college, left or stayed. New residents arrived who never knew that the river path behind the apartments had once been the site of a crime that shook a small community. They jogged along it in the early mornings, walked dogs under the street lamps at night, and lived unburdened by echoes they had never heard. Some of Lauren's co-workers knew her story pieces of it, at least. They admired her resilience, though they rarely used the word. Instead, they used words like reliable, steady, trustworthy. She earned a reputation for navigating high-pressure situations with calm precision. People assumed it came from experience in the emergency room, and maybe it did, in part. But the foundation of that calm had been forged long before, in an apartment she no longer lived in, on a night she rarely allowed herself to revisit. Her brother married, had a child, then another. His letters to her grew longer, filled with updates about school plays, scraped knees, and weekend trips to the lake. He sometimes included drawings from his children, pictures of stick figure families smiling under bright suns. Lauren taped the drawings to her refrigerator, small splashes of innocence that reminded her the world still contained uncomplicated joy. But tucked in the back of her desk drawer, she kept a small folder. Inside were copies of her police report, the evidence receipt for the latex glove, and the business card of Detective Kessler, long since retired. She kept them not out of fixation, but out of something quieter, a belief that unfinished stories should be stored respectfully. When she moved again in the early 2010s, she placed the folder at the bottom of a box labeled Old Documents. She didn't forget about it. She simply carried it forward, the way people carry memories that refuse to disappear completely. Riverton Heights itself kept small reminders of its past. A few residents remembered hearing police cars outside their building that night. Others remembered the community meetings that followed. And some mostly older neighbors who had lived there long before the assault still recalled the quiet fear that settled over the riverfront buildings. But such memories faded with each new generation, diluted by distance. Yet even as the case drifted into the background of public consciousness, a thread of resilience ran through it. A support group formed briefly for survivors of local assaults, gathering in the basement of an old church. Lauren attended a few sessions, listening more than speaking. She found comfort in the shared understanding, even if she didn't stay long. The women there, some older, some younger, carried stories that echoed hers in subtle ways. They understood what it meant to rebuild without expecting answers. Years later, Lauren became a mentor to a younger nurse who confided her own fears after an unrelated incident. Lauren offered her the same quiet reassurance she had once needed. She didn't reveal the origins of her wisdom, but the younger nurse sensed depth behind Lauren's calm, an unspoken well of experience she didn't pry into. And then, in the late 2010s, small references to new forensic techniques began appearing in professional articles Lauren read during her breaks. Discussions about genealogy, advanced DNA extraction, high-resolution profiling. She didn't allow herself hope. Not exactly. But something in her mind stirred gently, like a piece of driftwood shifting on the river's edge after years of stillness. Around that same time, a clerk archiving old case files stumbled upon several boxes whose labels had faded beyond recognition. One of them bore a date from the mid-90s and the barely legible words, Riverton Heights. He made a note to ask his supervisor whether the box should be cataloged differently. The supervisor, distracted by budget meetings and staffing shortages, told him to place the box on the review later shelf near the front, where older cases were queued for reclassification. That small gesture, a box pulled from obscurity and set a few feet closer to the light, became the first step in a process none of them recognized at the time. A few weeks later, Sergeant Mara Ellison was assigned to lead a new initiative aimed at identifying cold cases suitable for forensic reanalysis. When she walked past the newly shifted shelf, her eyes paused on a box with a yellowing label and a case number she didn't recognize. She pulled it toward her, feeling the shift of weight inside. It was the beginning of everything that would follow. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop an emoji in the comments. The box rested on the metal table like a question waiting to be asked again. For nearly 2 decades, it had existed in a silent corner of the evidence room, its weight unchanged even as the world moved on around it. When Sergeant Mara Ellison pulled it forward that afternoon, she did not yet know why it felt different from the others. She only knew that cases like this, long dormant, quietly breathing under layers of dust, deserved one more look before being filed away forever. She studied the label, squinting at the faded handwriting. Riverton Heights, August 18, 1996. The ink had thinned into a faint bluish line, almost lost beneath the yellowing paper. But the date sparked something, a memory from a training seminar where an older detective mentioned an unsolved assault from the 90s, one that never quite fit the patterns of the time. She opened the box carefully. Inside lay the sealed evidence bag. The glove was still visible through the stiff, clouded plastic, curled inward in a posture that had always unsettled the original investigators. It had been swabbed years ago and sent to a lab with outdated methods that returned a partial, unusable DNA profile. The case had stalled afterward. But the glove had been preserved, almost accidental precision, shielded from moisture, heat, and handling. Mara reached for the intercom and called for Tessa Rourke. The young forensic analyst arrived moments later, tying her hair back and slipping on gloves in a practiced motion. She froze when she saw the evidence bag. "That's the glove," she murmured. "It is," Mara said. "And this is our second chance." Tessa lifted the bag and held it to the light. The texture of the latex had changed subtly, aging into a pale, waxy finish. But the inner surfaces looked intact. She turned it slowly, examining the creases, the faint discoloration along the palm, the places where skin and sweat would have collected under pressure. "With the new extraction and microswab methods," she said, "we might actually get something clean." "That's what I'm hoping for," Mara replied. "We'll send it to Columbus tonight." The glove was placed in a specialized transport container, cushioned against vibration and sealed with a fresh tag. As they loaded it into the courier vehicle, Mara felt a quiet shift inside her, an intuition that something long held was loosening, like a knot beginning to unwind. At the Ohio State Forensic Genomics Laboratory, the glove was handled with the kind of meticulous care usually reserved for fragile historical artifacts. Scientists in protective gear logged each step, noting the condition of the evidence and its promising preservation. The room smelled faintly of ethanol wipes and ozone from the equipment, a clean clinical scent that felt strangely hopeful. The process began with microswabbing the interior of the glove, focusing on the wrist area where skin cells tended to accumulate. Under ultraviolet light, faint residues appeared as ghostly streaks along the inner palm. Tessa watched as the analyst took samples with brushes fine enough to lift particles invisible to the naked eye. The samples were placed in silica column extraction tubes, then spun in high-speed centrifuges that looked more like medical instruments than tools of justice. Modern polymerase chain reaction machines hummed a low rhythm as they amplified the isolated fragments, building the DNA sequence layer by layer. Hours later, a nearly perfect profile appeared on the screen. It was so complete, so sharply defined, that Tessa felt a jolt of disbelief. The original investigators never had a chance with the tools they'd had. But now, years later, technology had reached a point where even small degraded samples could speak clearly. They ran the profile through Cody's, no direct hits. This too was expected. The next step was the one Lauren Pike had never dared hope for. The DNA was anonymized and entered into a genealogical matching system, where it began weaving through millions of public markers submitted by distant relatives who had never imagined their data might someday help solve a crime. Slowly, matches bloomed on the screen. Third cousins. Fourth cousins once removed. Patterns formed a cluster centered around Marshfield County. Dr. Elise Garner, the forensic genealogist overseeing the process, leaned forward as the branches of the family tree began connecting through records, obituaries, census data, and digital archives. The name that surfaced again and again was Durning. The Durning family had lived in Riverton Heights for generations, moving only in small circles along the river and across the industrial district. As the tree narrowed toward living male descendants who would have been the right age in 1996, one name stood alone. Caleb Durning, 54 years old. Maintenance supervisor at the University Hospital. Former employee at a medical supply warehouse. A man who would have worn latex gloves daily. A man who would have known the layout of apartments housing students, nurses, and night shift workers. A man who had lived within 3 miles of every known assault. Tessa felt her heartbeat in her ears. She printed the confirmation, hands slightly trembling, and handed the paper to Mara when she returned to Columbus to receive the results. Mara read the name twice before speaking. "He was right there," she whispered. The entire time. The twist came later, during the genealogical deep dive. Dr. Garner discovered a non-paternity event in the 1960s, someone listed as a father who was not the biological parent. Tracing the biological lineage led to a long closed line of small-time burglars and trespassers. The crimes were minor but carried a distinct pattern. Slipping into places unseen, moving quietly through unfamiliar spaces, avoiding confrontation. It did not excuse anything. It did not predict what Caleb had done. But it suggested a learned familiarity with the art of intrusion, passed down not as a legacy, but as a behavior absorbed through proximity. The next step was confirmation. Detectives conducted discreet surveillance on Caleb, observing his routine at the hospital and his home. One morning, he tossed a paper coffee cup into a bin behind the staff entrance. Investigators collected it minutes later. The DNA test matched the glove precisely. When Mara called Lauren, she did so with the steady tone she had practiced all afternoon. And yet, the words still trembled slightly as they left her mouth. "We have a suspect. It's confirmed." Lauren sat at her kitchen table as she listened, the late afternoon sun casting a warm strip of light across her hands. She didn't speak at first. Then she asked the single question she had carried across decades. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Mara said. "It's him." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of years, full of the heaviness she'd been holding, full of the realization that someone had finally answered the question she had lived with since that night. When the news began quietly circulating through the department, and among the small circle of people who had followed the case for years, there was no celebratory rush. Instead, there was a collective exhale. A tension that had stretched across time finally eased, one thread at a time. Lauren placed her hands flat on the table. She closed her eyes. She allowed herself a long, steady breath. For the first time, she felt something close to release. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. The morning they went to arrest Caleb Durning began like any other in Riverton Heights. A thin layer of frost clung to the grass, and the air carried the flat, metallic cold that settles in the Midwest before dawn. At 6:30, the street on Oakview Lane was quiet, lined with modest homes still wrapped in sleep. The houses seemed almost indistinguishable from one another, each with the same slanted roof lines, the same aging mailboxes, the same porch lights that had burned through the night. Caleb stepped out onto his driveway wearing a gray jacket and carrying a travel mug. He looked like countless men in town beginning their day, preparing to drive toward another shift at the university hospital. For a moment, he simply stood there, sipping the steaming coffee, unaware of the convergence forming around him. Two unmarked cars approached from opposite ends of the street, slowing in a coordinated pattern learned through years of practice. Sergeant Mara Ellison stepped out first. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. When she called his name, he turned slowly, the mug still in his hand, confusion flickering across his features. He didn't run. He didn't protest. His shoulders lowered a fraction of an inch, as if some private understanding settled over him before the officers even reached him. They placed him in handcuffs, the metal clicking into place with an understated finality. One neighbor watched from a porch, tightening their robe against the cold. Another peered from behind a curtain, whispering something inaudible to someone unseen. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't chaotic. It was quiet, an ending unfolding in the same tone as the years that had preceded it, subtle, still, unannounced. Caleb said very little during transport. He didn't ask why. He didn't claim innocence. He simply stared out the window, watching the shapes of familiar roads and buildings pass by, the hospital entrance getting smaller in the rearview mirror, as though a door was closing behind him. At the station, he was processed with the same calm efficiency that governed all arrests. Photographs, fingerprints, the signing of forms. When Mara read the DNA match results aloud, he listened without reaction. When she explained the genealogical tracing and the confirmation from his discarded cup, he lowered his gaze but did not speak. Only when she mentioned the date, August 18th, 1996, did something shift in him. A faint tightening in his jaw, a flicker in his eyes that looked like recognition or resignation or both. He did not confess, but he did not deny anything either. His silence became its own kind of admission, a hollow space in which the truth echoed more loudly than any spoken words. Word of the arrest reached Lauren by mid-afternoon. She was at home, folding laundry when her phone buzzed. Her brother's voice trembled slightly as he asked whether she had seen the news. She hadn't, and he hesitated before saying the name, not wanting to shape the moment incorrectly. When she heard it, she found herself sitting down without meaning to, gripping the edge of the couch cushion until the dizziness subsided. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply breathed in and out, slowly, grounding herself in the fact that something long held had shifted. She whispered a single phrase that no one else heard. "It's over now." She didn't yet believe it fully, but saying it felt like unlocking a door that had been stuck for years. The trial began several months later. By then, the news had spread across Marshfield County, drawing quiet attention from those who remembered the string of assaults and the whispered fear that once crept through the riverfront buildings. The courthouse steps filled with reporters only on the first day. After that, the coverage softened into a respectful distance, as though the community understood the need for privacy more than spectacle. Inside the courtroom, the lighting was plain and unforgiving, illuminating every detail with an unembellished clarity. People spoke in measured voices. Pages rustled as attorneys prepared their questions. A faint hum from overhead vents created a steady undercurrent beneath the proceedings. Lauren attended the sessions she felt strong enough to face. She sat alongside other survivors, some she had met in support gatherings years earlier, others she recognized only from fleeting descriptions in old police reports. They shared glances of quiet solidarity, reminders that none of them had endured their experiences alone, even if they had been isolated at the time. When the prosecutor outlined the forensic genealogy process, the courtroom leaned into the explanation. The diagrams, the family tree, the small cluster of relatives that converged on Caleb's lineage, they all carried an understated weight. Science had reached backward through time and drawn a precise line to the man sitting at the defense table. Caleb watched the presentation with the stillness of someone absorbing a long-delayed inevitability. His attorney questioned the methods, but the evidence held firm. The DNA from the glove matched the sample recovered from his discarded coffee cup with a degree of certainty that left no room for doubt. The jury listened closely, their faces shifting subtly as each new piece of information layered onto the last. Lauren did not speak in court until the very end. When the judge invited survivors to offer statements during the sentencing phase, she walked to the podium with deliberate steps, her hands steady at her sides. She had worried for weeks that her voice might shake or that words might betray her. Instead, she found a calm she didn't expect. She described the night briefly, focusing on the aftermath rather than the act itself. She talked about the years that followed, the way she learned to fold fear into routine, the way her life kept moving forward even when parts of her wanted to stay frozen. She spoke of resilience without dramatizing her pain, letting truth settle into the room through quiet, measured breaths. For a moment, the courtroom felt suspended. No one moved. Even the judge appeared to breathe more slowly. Caleb didn't look at her while she spoke. He stared downward, hands clasped, eyes unfocused. Whether this was guilt or detachment or something else entirely, no one could say. But he remained still long after she returned to her seat. When the verdict came, it landed with a sense of inevitability. The jury found him guilty on multiple counts, their decision as steady and clear as the evidence that had brought them there. The judge delivered the sentence in an even voice, outlining the years of imprisonment with a formality that felt almost ceremonial. The room exhaled as though it had been holding breath for decades. Some survivors quietly wiped tears. Others sat in stillness, absorbing the moment with a heaviness that wasn't sorrow but release. Lauren closed her eyes briefly, letting the words echo through her. She didn't think of revenge or triumph. She thought of the river outside the old apartment, the morning fog, the way she had stood on that balcony without knowing how much her life was about to change. After the proceedings ended, Mara approached her. They didn't speak right away. There was no need for many words. When Mara finally said, "You did everything right," Lauren shook her head gently. "We all did," she replied. It just took time to catch up. As people filtered out of the courthouse, the late afternoon light spilled across the steps. It cast long, warm streaks on the pavement, softening the lines of the building that had hosted so much waiting, so much silence, and finally, so much truth. Outside, the courthouse lawn rustled in the breeze. The trees swayed with a slow, steady rhythm, as if acknowledging the shift in the air. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. Just a town adjusting itself around a truth it had carried quietly for far too long. Lauren walked to her car feeling lighter than she had in years. Not healed entirely, some things could not be undone, but steadied, grounded, released from a question that had followed her through every version of her life since that night. The answer had finally arrived, and with it, a strange, gentle sense of closure. In the months after the verdict, the town settled into a quieter rhythm, as if the closing of the case allowed Riverton Heights to finally breathe. People went back to their routines, but something subtle had changed. The uneasiness that once lingered in the riverfront neighborhoods loosened its grip. The evening walks returned. The balcony lights that had stayed off for years flickered back on. Life didn't reset, but it softened. Lauren felt that shift too. Not in sudden waves, but in small, almost imperceptible ways. She found herself lingering a little longer at the windows, watching the late afternoon light settle across her street. She slept more deeply. She caught herself humming softly while brewing tea, something she hadn't done in decades. Even the quiet no longer felt like a place where danger might hide. It became simply what it used to be, a space to rest, to breathe, to be. She kept the folder of old documents, but she no longer opened it. It remained in her desk drawer, not as a weight but as a marker of how far she had carried herself. She added one final sticky note inside it, before closing the drawer for good. It read simply, "I'm still here." For her family, closure came in the form of seeing her at peace, watching her reclaim moments that had once been strained. Her brother noticed it first in the sound of her laugh, fuller now, less guarded. Her mother noticed it in the way Lauren's voice no longer tightened when the past came up in conversation. Healing didn't erase the hurt, but it allowed new memories to grow where fear had once taken root. For investigators like Mara, the case became a reminder of why persistence mattered, of how evidence stored carefully could outlast entire eras of technology, waiting for the right tools, the right moment, the right hands. She often thought about the glove, the object that once symbolized control, intrusion, and fear. Now it represented something else entirely: consequence, truth, and the quiet endurance of science catching up to the shadows. Even the river seemed different. Its surface, once a mirror of the uncertainty that haunted the town, now reflected wider swaths of sky. On some evenings when the breeze carried the scent of water into the city's older streets, it felt like a gentle reminder that time moves forward, no matter how long certain stories linger. And yet, sometimes time loops back and returns what was taken. The legacy of the case lived not in the fear of what happened, but in the strength of those who survived it, those who investigated it, and those who refused to let it drift into silence. Justice had come slowly, far slower than anyone wanted, but it had come with steadiness, clarity, and undeniable force. And in that, there was hope. A hope that communities could endure. A hope that truth could outlast silence. A hope that even the faintest trace left behind, one glove, one fragment, one overlooked clue, could one day speak loudly enough to be heard. On a mild spring morning, Lauren walked along the river path behind her new apartment. The sun filtered through the trees, casting soft patterns on the ground. She stopped at the railing, resting her hand on the metal warmed by daylight. For a moment, she closed her eyes and let the breeze brush her face. Nothing about this moment tied her to the past. It belonged entirely to the life she had built beyond it. She opened her eyes, breathed in deeply, and continued walking, the river at her side moving steadily toward the horizon. Which case should we tell next? Leave your suggestion below.